The purpose of this talk now is going to center around bootstrapping network effects. It's like part of the core concepts that we try to figure out when we're designing token models, because obviously if you want your network to actually be sort of successful and have usage of the token, if you guys attended the talk that we gave this morning, this is all to do with the thickness side of things and actually getting people to use your platform. So I think Rocco and I will just lead you through a general kind of high-level overview of what we spoke about earlier on, but otherwise I want people to just ask us questions. The advantage that you have talking and asking us questions is we've dealt with probably way too many potential clients and vetting than we'd expect, and sort of leading clients ourselves through the whole ConsenSys and Token Foundry program, which is like an end-to-end consultancy process of leading these guys into token design and launching their tokens on our platform at ConsenSys. So we have an experience dealing with these guys, and it'll be interesting to hear what your thoughts are and the kind of questions that you want answering. So yeah, Rocco, do you want
going back to what we talked about earlier, mostly token primitives, what tokens are. There are 4 kind of basic primary functions of paying, voting, locking, and representation. In the case of tokenized securities, we went over a couple enterprise cases. We went over 2 models, that being Augur being a work model, traditional, and 0x being a pure governance model, and the issues with that. But yeah, this talk is supposed to be geared more towards bootstrapping network effects. Now, it's always a very tricky subject. Like, how do you rate the social aspect of a project? How do you the whole narrative right now around the space is capturing hearts and minds. And the problem is what can go wrong with that as well. So I'll kind of start from the beginning. If you take Bitcoin, for example, it doesn't have any marketers, doesn't have PR firms, not a centralized company, so to speak. It does have a first mover advantage, but it managed to capture hearts and minds. It wasn't this kind of quick burn in, burn out kind of situation. It's kind of lasted this long because of network effects, because people started building on the protocol once they saw it had actual value. It took a lot longer, but it's kind of that retention, that kind of base layer is what solidified and kept it so strong. Now, when we're talking about token models and ICOs and those kinds of launches, it's either lightning in a bottle or it's not. You could have something fade out very quickly. You could have actually something that retains, but it still hasn't been tested either because it hasn't been, years, so to speak, like Bitcoin has had time to actually measure this. When people turn to network effects, they'll typically talk about Telegram numbers, which are BS for anything. They'll talk about Twitter numbers, which are also BS and easy to create artificial numbers on. The main baseline for network effects has turned into a game of like what value is your actual product providing and what chain is it building on.
Yeah, I'd also say that if you wanted to consider it to a typical business model, Bitcoin was your first mover. And in some ways, first movers never usually last as long as potentially Bitcoin has. But in the crypto sphere and the timeline that we've endured so far, it's still very early on, in my opinion. One thing I will say is before Bitcoin got all popularized, it was very much the case of people who actually wanted to use the tech finding means to use the tech. Whether it was Silk Road, it was a use case. People were using it to transact value between each other. Whether you're looking at South America or Brazil, for example, where Bitcoin is a massive, massive deal. If any of you guys have popped over there, you'll see graffiti works of Bitcoin just being painted everywhere. And, that might seem quite sort of contextual at that point, but people are actually using it. I spoke to this guy who has born and brought up in South America, and the point he made was, growing up, there'd be times where my mum would come and collect me and my sister from school, would go to the shops and spend loads of money buying all this stuff. And they're asking her, and they're like, why are we doing this? Because she was like, well, tomorrow inflation's going to hit so badly that all the sort of money that we have right now isn't going to have the same purchasing value that we had beforehand, right? And then he had a context of where he'd send Bitcoin to his brother or whoever halfway across the country, which would typically take 2 weeks. So, all the standard use cases that were being used for Bitcoin was being put to a just purpose. Then comes commercialism and capitalism and everyone trying to make a quick buck, realizing that they could probably write a paper and have loads of money loads of people dump loads of money into their projects, and it all gets sort of strewn out of proportion in that sense. So that's the case with Bitcoin I see in a lot of.
And to speak to that too, even now you'll find in countries that are having serious issues with inflation, local Bitcoin's volume is skyrocketing. Places like Venezuela, Iran, Turkey, Argentina, you'll see that people are actually using it as a hedge. But speaking to network effects, also on a it's easy to talk to Bitcoin being the first mover, but like another good example is like if you've heard of the project Nano, which was formerly Rivlox. It's been around for a number of years. It had an interesting kind of tech background. It's called Black Lattice. It's like a DAG structure, similar but different to a blockchain. And the project originally, years ago, gave people 10,000 units just for opening up a wallet. It was simple enough. Some people knew about it if you were crawling Bitcoin Talk, which is kind of the legacy forum where a lot of the original conversations with Satoshi was happening, and then eventually a project started launching through Bitcoin Talk, like having an announcement thread launched on Bitcoin Talk. This project called Riblox had limited liquidity for a long time. And going back to this hearts and minds narrative, you capture enough social influence, you capture enough people talking about it, you capture value in essence, even though it may be even speculative value. And I'm not saying I'm against speculative value. I think speculation's a great thing. It's what bootstraps networks, to be completely honest. It's what Bitcoin's built on speculation. And Nano, which it is now, had very low liquidity at the time, and then eventually 2017, you had people start to talk about it. Things skyrockets. Some absurd percentage starts getting listed everywhere simply because it captured the hearts and minds of people, not because it had this like crazy value proposition, not because it was being adopted everywhere, not because everyone was using it, but because of pure speculation. Because this space at the end of the day right now as it is dominated by speculation. It is this hearts and minds narrative that will always be there. It's what you have to, it's capturing that social side. Is it going to be the influencers? Is it going to be, a small wave of retail investors creating this, or is it, what's that catalyst going to be? Is the question.
I have an open question to you guys because, I want people to ask questions and sort of get involved in discussion and stuff. Who here thinks BNB coin, Binance coin, is a good idea? An exchange token. 2, 3. Okay, cool. Who's looked at the charts of BNB for the last 9 months during the bear market? What's the difference between, so Clay, what's the difference between that chart and every other chart you've seen?
It's had a lot more, it hasn't dipped as much.
Right.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, there's more demand.
Okay, cool. So this is something that Rocco and I have been looking into for a while now, which is, what do you call it? Trade mining or whatever the hell? Anyway, the point is, the concept of an exchange token is, okay, cool. You want to aggregate and use my exchange, my purpose, my functionality or whatever. We're going to give you something that's going to allow you to trade at lesser fees, or we'll cover the gas costs to a certain extent. And it's a truly remarkable version of, or sort of example of a marketing sort of like ploy that's worked in some kind of favor, right? Because be it there's a dip in the market or an upstep in the market, you're an exchange that's allowing value transfer between all these different tokens, and you're managing to capture that value with this one token. The reason why investors, speculators, or whatever within this current market would want to sort of aggregate and use your platform is simply because of that discount. The reason why other people, normal consumers, want to trade with that token would be simple value transfer between the tokens that they're trying to sort of liquidate.
And to speak to that also, Binance also has a mechanism of buying back tokens, which is kind of, not legal advice, but sounds and smells like a duck, so to speak. But that also gives you access there. And also you have projects in terms of network effects that fail at what they're doing. Not too long ago, I put out a blog on something called Futility Tokens. It was a number of projects that ended up retiring their token in some form, or shape or form. They involved were a company called DigiPulse, which was some kind of will your cryptographic assets to your ancestors, to your descendants, just pay a small fee in our token or buy the service, we'll take care of the rest for you. Turns out that only 2 people actually used their token to buy the service. The rest, hundreds of others used, Ethereum, for example, something more liquid. They're not using their token. So the company ended up capitulating and turning their token, they're going for an equity play now. The next was Mercury Protocol, which was backed by Mark Cuban. It was this great, we're going to revolutionize chat applications. They created a payment token for their ecosystem. It looked like they didn't want to get into any regulatory trouble, and they kind of discontinued the trading of the asset. Then you had Co-Founded, which was like this incubator for tokens. They capitulated, but they wanted this kind of narrative control. So they were like, yeah, we're having this creative destruction. We're buying back the tokens. And lastly, Economy, which was maybe a 1 to 2 year old project, realized that the token really didn't really do much. They were also doing buybacks, which is not really utility. as I'll say here, and are turning that into equity as well. So narrative control is a big thing on the project end, but also on the community end. These large communities that bought into these projects now have to, they're under the control of the constraints of the leaders of these projects.
I will say, like, something that I find a lot of protocol teams not to consider very much when they come and approach us anyway is they tend to forget the whole business side of things. Like, when you're setting up a protocol, you're trying to address a market that a business or conventional legacy system has already tried to address, right? So now you're trying to redefine that. For you to assume that all of this is suddenly going to become decentralized and not use legacy infrastructure in some way, shape, or form, and I use it very much from like the front end. If I want to spend or use this platform, I'll probably go through it using fiat, right? Because that's going to be the easiest UX to use. So someone has to be managing that interface between fiat and token exchange, and whatever that may look like, whatever. But the point I'm trying to make is, it's very subjective, definitely in this current state, where I'd say we're more in like smoke and mirrors right now. CryptoKitties. Can anyone give me a good reason why CryptoKitties hit it off at the time that it did?
Big captured hearts and minds. It was the boom of the NFT.
Sure.
It's the NFT rush, captured hearts and minds.
Yep.
Not that it did anything relatively new. It's just now
Yep.
we have NFTs on a blockchain and they're cats.
I could have made a centralized version of that.
And it probably would have worked actually
And it
more
probably would have
efficiently.
worked out. But, people chuck blockchain on stuff. Kodak coin. Why did their stock jump 120%? Anyone give me a good answer? And then crash after. But yeah.
Yeah, speaking to this as well, earlier in our presentation, we did a longer presentation earlier for those who weren't here. We talked especially about capturing value on top of protocols. Someone asked a good question about, what do you see more, capturing value, the protocols or the applications built on top? We talked in particular about 0x. And 0x, the asset itself, does absolutely nothing. The reason, and this is me speaking to this very bluntly, the reason why it has its price currently is because of speculation. It's the first token listed on Coinbase, for example. It's supposed to be a governance asset. It was a bit of a cop-out from the payments aspect that they had. Fine. But as 0x, the company and the asset you're building, how are you truly capturing value? And the thing is, all these relayers that built on top of 0x, the exchanges that kind of take care of, have 0x on the back end, they're eating 0x's lunch by just, building on top of it. So Radar Relay, Paradex, DDEX, all these guys are making a mint on trading fees while 0x didn't beat them to the race in terms of setting up one of the first successful relayers. If 0x was developing the protocol, it's great that they're shipping code, but also set up the first order book on top of 0x, it might have been a different future.
It's important to figure out where value capture is going to be and what you define as value capture. So for example, if you're purely thinking in terms of monetary wealth and trying to make money off of all of this, then it's likely that if you build a service provider on top of a protocol, right, you stand the benefits of using this shared infrastructure and being able to leverage resources across the whole platform. The reason why I'd back kind of like more of the fat protocol thesis where, we're looking at like platform plays like, the Ethereums, the Cardanos, the R-chains of this world that are actually trying to build out ecosystems is, you're trying to figure out ways that everyone can play ball on your ecosystem. Like, think about it, like Amazon, Microsoft, Google. What are they all offering companies right now that make them a dominant player in the market? It's cloud computing services, right? They're always backed by, either AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud. And it's a similar kind of approach that's being seen with actual protocols.
And I think it's good to think of that way now, especially while this stuff is still being built out and secured. You'll find your protocols, even your second layer protocols like 0x, Augur, that'll be established. But until then, there's a bit of a time gap. Like even talking to the 0x example of a relayer, even if let's say I took Augur and all the predictions markets and created an order book for sports predictions markets, me as a firm in the Augur ecosystem, I'd be capturing a ton of value because people who want purely sports predictions markets would come to my order book if I provided a good enough experience. And I'd be capturing value not even on the Oracle end that the workers of the network are capturing, but just purely building a service on top of Augur.
Yeah. I will also say one thing that I've noticed that keeps on cropping up in all of these conferences and the people that we're speaking to more attention is being paid towards the UX side of things. And you guys may think that's a bit ridiculous, right? Because the technology is so immature and young. So, why aren't we focusing more on that? BIDL is a term that's being chucked around a lot during these conferences, build and they will come. Yeah, that's true to some extent. But at the end of the day, if I need to use your service, and remember, the question you need to ask yourselves are, who makes up the majority of people who haven't been onboarded onto this technology just yet? It's the people who don't understand how to use this technology in general, and people who haven't even used crypto right now. Someone quoted a stat the other day where apparently under 1% of the population is even invested in crypto. Even if it was 2% or 3%, whatever, it's still massively undervalued at this point. And what I want to say is, if you want sort of to onboard these kinds of people, I don't want to have to come on and use your protocol and also have to work out how much gas I need to pay. Like, if I were to take sort of a biased opinion, I'd say it's on the onus of the service providers or protocol providers to cover for that gas transaction, for example, if I were to buy something. I don't even know that gas is being sort of operated in the background. I shouldn't need to know that blockchain is being used necessarily.
And with dApps, which a lot of people hype up. First off, dApps really have no usage at the moment. It hasn't captured the hearts and minds, so to speak. The most you'll see in dApp usage is typically two things. One is gambling, which still is effectively handled by centralized services. And two is exchanges, basically places to move more tokens around. So spending to move more tokens. Nothing really outside of that has really captured a lot. Even Augur, as a decentralized predictions market platform, still does not have a ton of daily active users at all. We're still in the exchange, and what that signals is still being in this kind of exchange and gambling spot. I was like, okay, we still have a lot of maturing to do in this space, but it's still very sentiment driven, very hearts and minds capturing moment in terms of bootstrapping network effects. And if you market something too hard, it might burn out very quickly. But as we were talking about, we definitely want to open this up as a Q&A. We gave our presentation earlier. It was a lot longer, but this session's more of kind of an informal riff session on bootstrapping network effects and also kind of these networks in general, even token design. So we're kind of here. If you guys have any questions for us, please let us know.
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned CryptoKitties and how frankly it was done and centralized.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that opens just a broader question of at this stage of the market, how important is it to convince the purists that whatever application you have or protocol really must use the blockchain? Must, there is no analog that could successfully compete with it.
Yep. I absolutely hate that kind of line of thinking. Anyone who's trying to convince you that they need a blockchain, it's really difficult to do that. There's one thing that public blockchains handle very well, and that's trustless payments, especially if you're using something like Bitcoin or Ethereum. But people will come up to you and say they need this blockchain. It's still way too early for that. No one really needs I'd say a massive chunk of all the projects you've heard about can be effectively handled with centralized services that'll provide a more efficient case for consumers on the other end and people who are actually using it. It's just become kind of a buzzword.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason why a lot of these individuals are referred to as evangelists or purists, purely for that reason, because they're trying to peddle technology which may not necessarily be mature enough to be used on an enterprise sort of scale, right? We deal with enterprises every day. And one thing we definitely know that they're thinking is, what are the three common problems that people, or two common problems that people always bring up? Scalability and interoperability. Now, if I were to offer you a centralized version or solution that's already been set up, it might be pretty bad and use pretty high inefficient costs of transactions, but it works and people are using it. If you look at things like things that if I were to be on the contrary and show you things that have actually been kind of disrupted, look at Swift. Swift is the traditional format that banks use to transfer money internationally or cross-border, right? Typically, settlement occurs within maybe minimum 4 days. It's the analogy that people like to use is it usually is quicker for you to jump on a plane, pay for your flight, take the money across border, and then deliver it in hand to people before the money actually makes it to you, right? And then then comes along competitors like, all right, don't ban me from using this, but Ripple, okay, and let's focus on their product that's X-current, which doesn't use the token XRP. But they've got rid of intermediaries out of that. Instead of 6 intermediaries that it'll take to send money across border, it's now 2 or 3. And that's instantaneously a lot quicker than usual. And you've got enterprises like Santander using it with their banking app. So
I also spoke recently at a thing in Chicago called Loyalty Live. It was about loyalty points in a blockchain, which I'm still not convinced of either. And part of my presentation at the ending, and it kind of hit me. It's one of those like moments in a presentation where you kind of go off script. You're like, wait, like it kind of clicks in that moment. And I said to the crowd, I'm like, does United really need a censorship-proof solution to their loyalty points? Like, is a nation state trying to censor United points? I really don't think so. but people on stage were trying to convince them that they needed a public blockchain, which was kind of odd. But yeah. Anyone else with questions, please?
Are you familiar with Steam, the way their token structure is, and how they bootstrap their
Yes.
speak to that at all?
So Steam was another one of Dan Larimer's Frankensteins. After BitShares, it was delegated proof of stake system. It's supposed to be kind of a way in which it was a good attempt, rewarding content creators on the platform for creating content, upvoting, curating in a way as well, but mostly rewarding people for the production of content. From what I know, they've had issues with a lot of their witnesses in the system. They're involved in ConsenSys, and they've also had issues with both the governance and economics of the problem of the platform. I like the idea of paying people for content. I think in the past there was like a yours.org that eventually like moved to Bitcoin Cash, but I think there's also YALS, which is someone trying to do content like payments using Lightning Network using Bitcoin. I like that kind of approach rather than making a network or a protocol. Originally, Steemit Graphene, it was meant for speed and also like storing data as well. But I like the approach of just like kind of having a separate, using an existing chain already for the rewarding of content and not suffering from some of the issues that Steemit suffers from. But it was, and at the end of the day, I do appreciate it being a way to bring content creators and consumers together in a way of like, almost like, I don't want to say decentralized Reddit, but like a Reddit-like clone using cryptocurrency incentives. So I can appreciate that. I know they're having issues now, but as a base layer and like what they tried to do at the time, I can appreciate.
It's kind of interesting too the way they structured their token.
Yeah, the 3-token system. Yeah,
System to try to
yeah,
deal with those incentives. I imagine they're still working.
to a degree.
Problem.
Yeah,
I'd say reputation is a pretty hard thing to crack, by the way. I know it's just an abstract part of Steemit and how they operate, but trying to get people to validate whether someone's done something well or not is pretty subjective. And if I was a token holder that could, for example, if there was a voting mechanism that could be like, hey, yeah, they're good, or let's downvote them, it's quite easy to sort of like train that on a Sybil attack or try and sway that in your favor, be it on a predictions market. Reputation is definitely one that factors into a lot of protocols that people try to figure out. It sort of stems from the high level identity crisis that people are trying to figure out on blockchain and what that's going to look like. So until we see more sort of fundamental infrastructure and plays that are being built in that sense, once the market matures more, you'll then see things like Steemit and stuff become a lot more popular than it is already, I think. There was a hand back there. Yes.
So there's this whole class of problems that have been solved through what I'd say intrinsic motivation. If you look at Facebook, you look at Wikipedia and everything. And now I think blockchain and cryptocurrencies has ushered in this kind of alternative thinking which you just spoke about. But I like the idea of content owners getting compensated, and you can, or content creators, right? And you can sort of extend that to anything from creating your own encyclopedia. But when you narrate this thesis to people that are out of the cryptocurrency, out of the blockchain space, one of the things I hear is they say, well, okay, if there's intrinsic motivation, it will work, but once you introduce money or economics or something tangible to motivate, then the whole system breaks down. And then you hear all sorts of, bad actors, this story, all these scenarios come up. Have you ever seen that happen to you as well, and how do you normally address that?
yeah. So what he was, if anyone didn't hear, he was talking about kind of the scenarios in which people talk about like, what is, don't get me wrong, like kind of that they like incentives breaking down, so to speak. People are worried about like cryptoeconomic incentives not being sustainable
When
for
money gets involved.
yeah, when money gets involved for certain projects, like it could kind of taint the well, so to speak. Whenever the main thing always to fall back on with cryptoeconomic incentives will always be Bitcoin. It's objective enough that miners are motivated by making the asset, and full nodes want to verify transactions. And both, it's all harmonious because at the end of the day, if the miners do something wrong, there's going to be issues. Like their main point is to act in line. That's the one thing Satoshi figured out is how do you incentivize the miners? Keep them in line, give them a reward, because if they screw up, they're not going to get the reward that they want. Once you introduce other factors, that's when it gets tricky. So take the encyclopedia approach. Might be interesting. So I think there's a project called Everypedia that's building on EOS. My interest is not even in. So here's the whole blockchain thing. Like when we talk about decentralized systems, the main thing we're looking for at the top, in my opinion, is censorship resistance. How much would it cost a nation state to actually take something down like that? The incentive part of Everypedia I'm kind of mixed on, but if you can create a censorship-resistant encyclopedia, so like something that provides, something objective. So like, let's talk about, talking about something the Chinese government did, and what is the ability for the Chinese government to actually censor something like an article on Everypedia that talks about it. That's kind of the main interest there. And then I think is kind of the selling point rather than the incentive to actually build the content. It's the inability of a nation state to actually take that down, depending on what the stakes are. And that's kind of how I think about it. In terms of the economic incentive, it's easy to fall back on Bitcoin because it's very objective. But in something like Everypedia, where you have articles on events that may have a tinge of subjectivity, I think the main selling point there should be censorship resistance. How much would it cost a nation state to actually take this down? What are the implications of building on EOS, for example, that has 21 block producers, and so on?
On the enterprise side of things, without digging too much into detail for each use case, that's one of their primary concerns, right? People within the enterprise space or legacy industries hate volatility, particularly when you start mentioning tokens. However, that hasn't put a dampener on the amount of conversations that have been initiated with us and other enterprises. So they definitely are expressing interest with particular use cases, but what they're trying to do, which I think is a very similar approach to what a lot of enterprises try to do when they try and broach any kind of new field or technology, is taking a more siloed approach. Now, obviously, when we're pitching decentralization 3.0 or whatever, that's quite contradictory in that sense, and people can get quite a lot of flack. But what that doesn't mean that's happening is enterprises are still experimenting within these sort of siloed kind of conflicts, these siloed kind of atmospheres, whether it's on a private DLT or not. So they're trying to address specific use cases in-house first, and trialing them on POCs before they become a more scalable thing. An example that I gave earlier on in my presentation this morning is with Walmart. They're not tokenizing their supply chain, but what the approach that they took is that they built something out. They approached all their rivals and formed a consortium which are now operating on this blockchain, and they've moved from 2 years of POC to now a scalable production, where they involve a lot of suppliers from their leafy green institutes that are sending spinach or whatever the hell, and saying, okay, cool, join this blockchain system, we'll reduce transaction fees in that sense, and let's see how this plays. A lot of chat around tokens have been very, very conservative, to say the least, but people are making moves behind the scenes is all I can say. If you look at like the existing tokens that are being used on the enterprise side of things, you've got, Rocco mentioned it earlier on the Loyalty Live kind of conference that he mentioned. They're looking at loyalty rewards and tokens. You've got Singapore Airlines that are operating with that. I mentioned earlier that, 2 days ago, Visa announced that they're doing their B2B Connect, which is their remittance transfer sort of architecture that they've been figuring out for a couple of years now. But they're saying that they tokenize customer data, or PII. I'm curious for them to release the architecture on that, because they say they use a universal identifier for those packets of data. But I'm interested to see where they keep that data, because I've heard echoes of them using Hyperledger, of which it'll be a private DLT, right? So I think this is going to be an iterative approach on the enterprise side of things. People are waiting for infrastructure to be built out to allow public and private to play ball with each other. I think the current use case that enterprises are using primarily on the public side of things is notarization, because bringing it all back to blockchain, or Bitcoin rather, high security is their biggest thing right now. You could argue if you wanted to build a game that requires a huge amount of throughput, you could use EOS, because the trade-offs you're playing there is maybe you don't really care too much about the security, or maybe you want to bet that none of the 21 validator sets are gonna cartel together and sort of like act as a double spend transaction. So there's different trade-offs that need to be figured out.
Bringing it back to the crypto economic incentive side, first, just a quick note, also the enterprise notary Factum's been around for a long time. It's a project, definitely a legacy project to keep on everyone's radar. And one of the things we do on our team is keep this idea, if you're not listening, you're not learning. Going back to the economic incentives of an encyclopedia approach, there has been a project back in 2017 called Lunar, which was built on Ethereum to do a decentralized encyclopedia, and I don't think it's really gaining a lot of traction. But yeah, to go back to that. Yeah.
Okay, so bear with me about some of the technical details of this, but I'll do my best here. So to my understanding, on the Bitcoin network, if you have insufficient funds in your account to pay both the transaction you're sending, that amount, and the fee, then it just says insufficient funds and it stops, and you have to load that wallet with enough to pay for the fees and the transaction if you're sending money to another address, right?
Yeah.
But then on Ethereum, if you're sending just a single transaction, there's like a, what, 21,000
The gas, yeah.
limit that's just allotted to cover one transaction. But if anything, if it's a smart contract where it does say something like split royalties to different rights holders, if that was like the use case, then it would eat your fee for the it would eat your mining fee. But if you don't have enough extra in that wallet, or you didn't set the
Yeah, you could run out of gas on Ethereum.
use the fee and it doesn't execute, and so you have to
Yep.
do it again. So that's a total like cluster, for especially users who don't have that knowledge of it. So you'll
Yep.
see the advanced tab to increase that on certain wallets, and if you don't notice that, then you're basically setting people up to wonder why their transactions are working. So
Yeah.
my question is, I don't understand Solidity. I don't know if this is something that's possible with Solidity or some other way of doing this, but it seems like shouldn't there be a way to put the fees on the other side? So
On the developer side.
and not out of your wallet?
Oh, to kind of minus it from the transaction.
Exactly. So you would just know that if the network is congested, then whoever you're sending money to would take a bigger cut of it.
Well, that's where it gets tricky, is because then you'd be kind of giving the other side less of what's expected, especially if you have a certain value that's required to trigger something, or if it's a payment that has to be met in full. That's
Like with PayPal, which obviously I would want to see that be an incumbent to these platforms, but if you're a seller on PayPal that if someone doesn't select friends or family or
You pay a fee.
then you're going to take a cut out of that, and you
Yeah.
might add that in, knowing you might, if you want the customer to keep that, then you would add that in.
And I think Ijaz touched on this earlier, where one of the advantages we see is like the developer side subsidizing transaction fees. It can be done on Ethereum in a few ways. I've seen people use smart contracts to basically be token controllers, and then it would just manage balances internally. It's a bit centralized, but even on the EOS side too, like we'll have our opinions on EOS or whatever, but it's putting an emphasis more on the developer side subsidy. So they're paying for it on their end rather than the end user who, at the end of the day, we talk about this too, like no one really wants, if you're talking about the retail world or talking about the crypto world, you have about 96% of people who are like there to get their face ripped off on an exchange, and about 4% who's really like thinking about what's being built here. And then take a step back at the crypto side, you see the retail side. The retail side does not want to see the blockchain. The retail side wants the thing to work. They might appreciate the fact that there is auditability, that you can see everything in the background if they so wish to do so. But on their front end, they don't want to see anything. They don't want those kinds of frictions, what you're talking about, where like if you don't have enough gas for a transaction, that it'll run out of gas. And you're talking about sending an Ethereum transaction, that it'll basically fail. And I'm in favor, like speaking to this, there could probably be ways around this where it's taken out of the actual transaction itself, but like I think it's more, the bigger picture is like looking into ways where there is a subsidy on the developer side, taking care of this on the front end so that people actually using the system don't have to worry about that on their end. Because if they're making money from the end user actually using the service, it should be in their best interest to subsidize it so you have more user interest in not failing from those issues.
I could say it's a weird liability for sure.
Yeah.
Being a business where we've just recently purchased a significant amount of Ethereum in order to pay for our consumers to now move their tokens off of our site.
Yeah.
And it's kind of one of those things where it's like, I have to look at the chart of Ethereum and say, is this an appropriate time to buy this now? Or should I buy it next week? Or should I worry that if I don't buy it now, in a week I'm going to buy it, it's going to be...
Yeah.
So that's why, like, you see, like, approaches that are being taken with, dare I say it, XRP. Okay, so obviously its price has been very volatile over the last God knows how long, and people are asking, well, hey, if XRP stands a chance of, you know, changing price in the time that I allow the transaction to happen, or I send, say, $1 million or $2 million worth of XRP halfway across the world, well, you know, that means I'm going to lose money, right? Well, two precautions or arguments that Ripple tends to use quite a lot is, well, this transaction is going to take 2.2 seconds, so what are the chances of that happening? Which is like, okay, whatever. The second point is the more valid one, which is, we've also established loads of LPs or liquidity providers at each of these geographic regions where all these banks are operating. So what happens is if you switch to XRapid and you're using XRP, they have a locked-in price that are being handled by a liquidity provider, which is a very traditional corporation or existing institute which has been used in traditional finance, and that hasn't changed. You know, it allows the blockchain to be used, but they take on the loss or fluctuation of price in that sense. So, like, traditional business dynamics don't go away just because we're trying to add blockchain to a lot of it. Subscription fees, for example, if you wanted to use a service, isn't going to go away. People are probably going to price their mechanisms based on, you know, their services based on whatever they think is fit. The difference here is loads of people are going to have the opportunity to do the exact same. So if you don't provide me with a good enough service that is not cost beneficial to myself and doesn't incur a lot of the transaction savings that I'm making, someone else is, and aggregate value is going to go to them.
And this definitely comes back to network effects. Like, if you want to win those hearts and minds, if that's a big glaring problem in the system where, you know, your transaction literally isn't sending because you don't have the fees to cover on top of the transaction amount, that's a problem. How do we think around this? How do we bring people into the system who don't want to see those frictions, you know, in this new system? They don't. If a centralized service can provide a better experience, they don't care about the decentralization aspect. People who tout decentralization and all the buzzwords, we're still in the sentiment phase, the speculation phase of these markets. Yeah. We market our solution to the Ethereum community. Yeah, and we're still. That's the thing. It's always interesting to see. It's still very crypto. This whole scene is very still small subset of reality. And like I said, even within the subset, 95 to 98 is an estimate from me. I actually, not from me. Back in July, Arthur Hayes of BitMEX was giving a presentation, and he's like, yeah, that amount just wants their face ripped off. And the rest are that kind of smaller micro subset are the builders, the people who are actually interested in this technology.
A really good gauge of figuring out whether blockchain is taking traction in the real world is don't go to a blockchain conference.
Yeah, if you go to any other conference besides a blockchain conference, you're like, it's interesting to be the outsider because then you're the weird blockchain guy.
Go to the Oil Trade Exporium 2018 and say that you're in blockchain, and they'll laugh at you. Go to any of these traditional enterprise conferences, and they'll be like, oh, they're very tentative. I'm going to this conference in like a week's time called Web Summit, which is like the biggest conference ever for business people, and they have a stupid amount of attendees and corporations and stuff like that. And this year the difference is, and this is the reason why I'm going, is there's a blockchain track that's dedicated to all of these things. Now, I know that a lot of the enterprises are probably going to be very cautious and wary of all these different things, but more importantly, they're going to have questions, and that's why I'm interested in going, because I want to hear what their issues are. It's not going to be, hey, I'm going to peddle, you know, Ethereum and stuff on you guys, and you guys should definitely do this. It's more to sort of listen to them and say, well, okay, what problems are you guys facing right now, and how can traditional tech within the blockchain space solve for that? Unstoppable
Applications unless you're the DAO.
Yeah, that was a question. Yeah.
How do you think the industry can solve the inherent issue of having decentralized
Yeah.
of the industry itself.
Yeah.
Just to finish this, is like the word like decentralization is more important than I think people realize.
And
And it gets hijacked by people that shouldn't be here and then deflated in its integrity. And then you have a bunch of people left that seem lost.
I'm first going to start off. I'm going to shill my own post that I published the other day on Token Daily called "The Death of Decentralization." Definitely to your point, and that is what happened in this space. Like, kind of decentralization became the buzzword for everything. It's like, oh, we're going to build this decentralized thing, throw a bunch of capital at us. But it's really important to come back and break down what decentralization actually means: censorship resistance, verifiability, auditability, accessibility, and so on, and kind of honing these characteristics. I think one of the larger ways that that could be recaptured is stop building garbage. This wasn't directed at anyone in this room, but honestly, stop building crap stop building a solution that doesn't have a problem. Everyone's like already 5 steps ahead when no one really identified what the problem they're solving is. They're just taking like the next big thing they see that they can find. Like, oh, you see, yes.
What if
Oh.
the problem is vaguely in the future? So, like, one reason I feel it's imperative to start decentralizing some things is that there's too much power over human rights in something like Facebook's hands, something like the government's hands, and it's just so obscure.
Well, that's the thing. It's like, take Facebook, for example, like a social media network. I don't think you'll have this successful, decentralized, tokenized kind of ecosystem, but you'll have attempts at creating almost federated networks. So like Mastodon, for example, is a federated instance for a social, like it's like a federated social media instance, so the power's not all in one entity's hands. But the problem is it gets kind of tainted. It's interesting, and I understand the thinking about this problem ahead of time. To the government side of things, I would say keep building on Bitcoin, keep building on Ethereum, like secure the base protocols first before we start tokenizing and building applications on top for no reason on that side. And then on the social media side, so the Facebook side, I don't think that'll be, I think it's kind of attacking too many things at once. I'm all in favor of like that kind of, that corruption side take care of, but like on the Facebook side, like specific applications, I think there are ways of decentralizing it without necessarily even moving towards a blockchain to begin with. Like Mastodon doesn't use a blockchain, it's federated networks. There are ways of kind of distributing this power without slapping the decentralization word, without slapping the blockchain word on it. And I think that's a more effective way. The currency side of things, the payment side of things, I could see being very effective with like keep building out Bitcoin, keep building out Ethereum, because these things have proven that they're there to kind of usurp these traditional financial systems that have corruption in them. But in terms of application side, like a Facebook, I think it's very important to look at all the solutions on the table before we default to blockchains. Because sometimes blockchain isn't the default solution, and then when we pile so much energy into that, it's what makes it look bad. Because it's like, hey, blockchain might not be the solution here, but when you have one guy saying that with 100 others saying, hey, we're going to decentralize Facebook and put a token on top of it and then have the sale, it just doesn't look good for the social aspect of this, which is actually very important. It kind of gets buried underneath the marketing, so to speak.
I think to put very simply, what Rocco was talking about is market's extremely immature at the moment. And to simply peddle a technology due to its fact that it's decentralized and distributed isn't necessarily the right way to go about it. I think there needs to be more attention on infrastructure and base layer protocols right now, because the fact of the matter is I don't think anyone has truly built a massive life-changing infrastructure solution right now on blockchain that is going to allow for a lot of people to use it and utilize it to their extent. On the payment side of things, yeah, Bitcoin and Ethereum are being used pretty well in a lot of use cases in terms of like medium of exchange. But in order to allow people to move more towards a decentralized side of things, they need to be confident that the tech is actually working in their favor, right? You're right, absolutely. Right now, there's too much power being held by certain few minorities, not minorities, but like majorities within certain legacy industries,
Oligarchies.
right? Yeah, oligarchies, right? And I'm all for that attitude of distributing power to a fairer distribution of power amongst participants, but it's not going to happen like that. And particularly not in a sense where we're still having issues with scalability and interoperability. There needs to be confidence built into a system which will allow people to actually build independently services that are going to be used. There needs to be identity plays that needs to be figured out before transparency like this is going to be worked into like a more enterprise solution. Like I was reading something the other day. Will Facebook and the Twitters of this world be around in 50 years? I don't know. Chances are there's a high probability that they may not, or they may have transformed into something completely different. The point is, with each technology revolution, as it gets built out, there are going to be different players that arise and use this technology in different ways. And I wouldn't say blockchain is at a space right now where we'll be able to make that judgment.
Anyone else have any questions? Yes.
Question. So I mean, besides the projects that Token Foundry has blessed right now, and you guys have talked about 0x protocol or whatever, but what types of companies, projects do you see as being a good fit for tokenized, to go the token route? So I'm just saying maybe like 2 years ago, something that, might have been tokenized or something like that makes sense, where it needs blockchain.
So in terms of tokenization, I do like things that exist in a gray area, especially, and I'll preface this with, this is all one giant science experiment at the end of the day, but things like Augur, for example, predictions markets, which can get dicey at times, things that would normally be censored, anything kind of pushing the limits and seeing if there is platform-grade censorship resistance. There's another project out called LivePeer, which is looking to do live streaming and transcoding. And if you have a government that's trying to censor a certain video from coming out, so let's say a war-torn area, and a government's not trying to let something come out, if a service like that can provide, if there can be a service like that that can provide that and test those limits of censorship resistance, then I'm all for it. In terms of tokenizing those, they typically revolve around workers on a network. And a decentralized set of workers. So like Augur, for example, are the oracles, and LivePeer are the transcoders. So those I like those tokenized systems because there's something measurable, there's value that's measurable coming back to the people who are staking and becoming the workers on those networks, and the service they're providing is in a gray area, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, an example I could give towards that is a bet I placed with a friend a while ago, where I'd say probably the first kind of use cases which will be focused on initially will probably be in the gambling industry, right? And yeah, sure, that sounds really risky, but in the gambling and gaming industry, what are the incentives that are laid out between participants? It's all game theory, right? At the end of the day, what's being employed in token economics? It's a lot of game theory and economic modeling. For example, with Token Foundry, the reason why we worked quite a lot with Virtue Poker in the poker industry is, figuring out a way to do sort of decentralized stakes and shuffling, if you like, of cards. It's a provable method that you can do. You go read the architecture on the white paper. I mean, I'd rather not delve into it right now. It'll be a much more lengthier talk. But it's a provable way of cryptographically shuffling cards. Sure, that may sound like BS, but it actually works. And you can provably see that on the blockchain. You have supernode validators, which will attest to whether something is happening or not. They're randomly selected, and you can't pick and choose the game that you're going to join. It's addressing a gray area market where a lot of Europe, Eastern Europe, doesn't have defined boundaries to how these rules are carried out on the online gaming industries under centralized entities. But in a decentralized form, yeah, it's working really well, and people are using it. Yes.
Interested in your criteria about when not to use a blockchain. You mentioned censorship and a couple of others, but I'm wondering what your thought is in things like media and fraud and being able to access the real things like Spotify and the cases against rights and attribution. Whether you think that's still a good use case of blockchain?
Yeah. So a few comments on this. I think I think Spotify is working on something blockchain related. I don't exactly know what. On the rights side of things, you see a lot of this with potential companies that approach us and say, hey, we want to sell data on a decentralized protocol. And we dig down into selling data packets and having data markets and stuff like that. And it gets really complex. But one thing which definitely surfaces when we're doing all of this analysis with data markets is there's no standard framework, right? There's no standard set of data. Like, for example, if I wanted to connect my IoT device to this protocol, right, and give you data from my Tesla car, how do I know that that's going to be like a Tesla car and that can be attributed to the device that I've put the serial number that I've attested to, right? There's no kind of way to sort of guarantee that this is going to in fact be the case. But if you had, say, someone who set up a registry, a data registry on this protocol that says, hey, I'm accepting all data from Tesla cars, and here's my set of frameworks that you need to meet. And only then will you be allowed onto my registry and list your car and the data that comes with it, and then people can purchase data from that. Sure. The question that now someone's probably going to have on their mind is, well, what if someone games the definitions of that registry, right, and takes all the money? Well, sure. The way that they're going to have an influence, though, is their reputation will go down if people are found to have mishandled their data on that. And someone else, being an open market on this protocol, will be able to set up another competing registry and source sort of liquidation from that. So I'd say on the right side of things, there's another project that we were working with at ConsenSys called ARA. If you guys want to check out the white paper, go figure it out. But it focuses mainly on content distribution, right, and rights. And within there, we look at several different things like RID, which is the identity play, and how sort of like rights are kept under DIDs and DDOs, which I won't go into it, but are different architectural components that will allow you to store and attest to data that is yours and not someone else's. So I think frameworks are a really cool use case that are being built on blockchain. Whether it needs a token specifically is another question, but I think this is a really cool use case for blockchain.
Yep. Sure.
What are your thoughts on the long-term prospects of token-curated registries?
You go first.
So TCRs, in my opinion, token curated registries, to do a quick overview. Imagine everyone in this room had to curate a list of blockchain projects. Simple as that. We take the Princeton Review's top 100 colleges and just give it to a bunch of people in a room with tokens who are going to vote on these actual aspects. There's a challenging aspect and so on. As for the future of TCRs, personally, I'm not sold. I think they end up being popularity. There's two things. The first is they end up being popularity contests. There's a reason why we leave the curation of information to specialized actors who can determine what is or what isn't supposed to be on a particular list. And the second aspect is that voting in blockchain systems is, number one, extremely critical and vulnerable. And the second thing is no one really does it. And I think Ijaz here can talk to a project we know called AdChain under ConsenSys, which has its own slew of problems as a TCR.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be biased and shit talk other people's projects. So let's talk about a ConsenSys project, right? If we look at AdChain, they were trying to solve, well, I wouldn't say they were trying to solve advertisement fraud, but they were trying to figure out where the boundary lies, right? And the whole premise of it was, hey, we'll have a TCR, and people can list validated publishers, of which I can then access this list if I was an advertiser and say, okay, these guys are all cool and vetted. I can use them, and all my impressions and numbers of views and stuff for my articles will be legitimate and not spurred by bots. So the point that Rocco is making on the turnout kind of thing is they distributed around 300 million tokens at their ICO to a bunch of different people who are using it. What percentage of those users voted on the first TCR application?
If you were in here earlier, don't raise
your hand if you know.
But if
someone chuck out like a percentage. Okay, we have 0.38. Okay, you guys have been doing your research. It was 2.4%. So maybe you're happier at that. But
we got 2.4% of people of those token holders actually participating in this system,
which is ridiculous because we then did a cost analysis and figured out it would cost you $5,000 to game the whole system.
And attack the network and bring it down.
So it's stuff like this that really, really needs to be figured out. On the advertising side of things, the issue, there's a few common issues that I see with TCRs. I would say TCRs work within smaller confines, where there's fewer participants that are trusted to a sense, but also know the sort of area. For example, if you had a TCR that was all to do with, what ingredients does Bob have in his kitchen cupboard? Bob's going to know, his mates are going to know, but everyone else is a subjective opinion that I'm going to be voting and staking on, right? There's no particular value that comes out of that. With TCRs, the issue is the subjectivity of it, right? It's all well and good having like a source of information. Like I like comparing oracles with TCRs, because oracles, if I asked the room here, if you guys were all the participants in this oracle, right, or TCR, or whatever the hell, and I said the question was, what's the temperature in LA right now? You wouldn't just be able to pull from one source. You'd be able to have an oracle that pulls from loads of different sources and then gets validated, right? If the question was, how many companies listed on the Forex 500 or Fortune 500 starts with the letter S and ends with the letter E, you could have someone that stakes a huge amount of tokens saying it's going to be it's this, right? And you could see someone who's done all the research, the background research, and staked maybe a small amount because they don't have enough money, the right answer. Now, if I came in as an adjudicator, and it depends on the layers of friction that it takes to solve that calculation. If I couldn't be bothered, for example, and I saw a mass pool of 1 million tokens based on this and 100 tokens based on that, I'm more aligned or incentivized to go with that, because there's a risk cost that you need to figure out, right? How much are you willing to bet and hence lose before you're able to place down that stake or token, which is what we see with TCRs, or what we have seen with TCRs. So there are definitely some kinks that need to be figured out.
Just a follow-up as an extension.
Yeah.
Wouldn't the solution, like potentially there are no solutions, but potentially need to try to handpick the initial set of curators?
I think Masari's working on this with their investors. They haven't released anything yet, but I think that's the angle they're going towards. An ad chain might work on a system of delegation as well, because at the end of the day, your speculators aren't specialized, but you may have the ability to basically delegate your vote and two specialists to actually carry the task out. So that's, again, TCR is very primitive right now, but we may have strides in that direction. I'm still not sold.
And one thing I'll say, bringing this back to the high-level nature of bootstrapping networks or whatever, there's some commonalities that you see with ecosystems like Ethereum, Archain, Cardano, Ocean Protocol, if you like, or whatever. They're all focusing on different sides of building out the protocol. The developer community, you have the business side of things, and then you have outreach. Like, look at what Cardano is doing. They have the Cardano, correct me here, IOHK, which focuses on the research side of things that gets peer reviewed, and they're focusing on the tech and building that out. You have Emergo, which is outreach in Asia, and then you have Cardano Hub, which is the foundation.
You see what happened with that.
Which focuses on outreach and strategy and a lot of different other things. So there's different verticals that are being done. Archain has the same thing. They have a focus on enterprise. They have a focus on more actual like startup natures and protocols that they want to build and seed the network, as well as developer talent and pool. Trying to figure out all these different pools and how they aggregate and will allow user value onto their platform is really important, I think, and is a trend that we're seeing with a lot of the top 10 crypto assets that are listed.
I think we have time for one more.
Yeah.
That's everyone. Go ahead.
Okay, so I've heard an argument made by Omar Bam of Crypto News, basically that a lot of the projects that are on this gravy train of doing ICOs and creating tokens are actually missing the very fundamental fact that you could very easily just use ETH as the native token and therefore have the network effect already established. So can you flesh out that argument?
Yeah, sure. My initial response to that is, if I set up... Sorry, can you hear me? Oh, right, yeah. The question was essentially, there's a lot of talk that is currently in the media or whatever as to why you can't just use ETH or Ethereum as your native token for your protocol. And the question is around sort of why would or wouldn't you use ETH? My initial reaction to that is, if you're building a token network on Ethereum to facilitate a particular use case, right? And you use Ethereum, the price fluctuation or value of that token isn't just attested or attributed to that specific use case on your token network. It is being pulled and influenced by every other ICO and network that is building and working on that. The issue there is if there's a hack on some exchange for Ethereum or whatever, it could lead to a massive depreciation of the asset that's got nothing to do with the value of your token being used within your network. and that means it could affect the way that your value model works.
I like the idea of valuation, like abstraction evaluation in terms of work networks and potentially governance as well. So take like like a TCR. Like imagine this whole LA Convention Center was Ethereum, and this room was our abstraction value for this TCR. We wouldn't want people who are at the other convention right now voting on this list of blockchain companies, so to speak, if that was the TCR, which is why it's important to actually abstract that value. As for payment tokens, that's a totally different ballgame. Like those should just not exist, and use Ethereum to eliminate friction, or use a stablecoin to have that volatility. But to accurately reflect the value of the network in the TCR case might be more beneficial.
Yeah. I think we're out of time, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Cool.
thank
Any
you
other
guys
questions?
again.
Please do.
Yeah, we'll be outside. So if you guys have anything else, please let us know.
Thanks.